Hello, I'm Hiroki Kojima, Director General of the Japan Foundation, New York. On behalf of the Japan Foundation and our partners, the Social Science Research Council and University of Southern California, I extend a warm welcome to all attendees of the Abe Global Forum 2025. This year's forum explores the theme, Globalization, Trade and Labor, and the Distribution of Wealth and Resources in Japan and the United States. Our speakers all come out of the Abe Fellowship Program, an initiative that operated for 3 decades as a collaborative effort between the Japan Foundation and the SSRC. Over the course of the period, the program supported nearly 450 scholars and professionals across the United States and Japan, fostering rigorous cross-national academic inquiry and contemporary policy-relevant research. The Abe Global Forum is committed to amplifying the research and expertise of Abe Fellows, bringing their insights on pressing global challenges to wider audiences. To fulfill this mission, the Japan Foundation and SSRC organized this annual event in collaboration with leading academic and civic institutions across the United States. At present, the world is undergoing profound geopolitical transformations, with the broader international community experiencing significant shifts in economic and political paradigms. Globalization appears to be reaching a critical juncture, necessitating a re-evaluation of its impact on trade, labor markets, and the distribution of wealth and resources. In today's discussion, we will examine the challenges and pathways to building a more stable and equitable society in an increasingly multipolar world. We are honored to convene such a timely and consequential dialogue today. So now, let me turn the program over to Dr. Saori Katada of USC. Katada-sensei, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Saori Katada. I'm a professor of international relations at University of Southern California, coming in from Los Angeles. This covers both the East Coast from the United States and Tokyo, but I'm kind of in the middle position, which is a kind of a good time for me to conduct this workshop at this forum. This is my great honor to be moderating today's session, focusing on globalization, trade, labor, and the distribution of wealth and resources in Japan and the United States. We have seen signs of challenges everywhere in the year 2025. On Japan's side, the Ishiba minority majority party of LDP led by Prime Minister Ishiba has struggled to shape economic policy in the face of various challenges, from inflation to various kind of opposition parties coming from the demand of distributor policies, such as emphasis on the child support, waiving of the high school tuition fees, as well as raising tax exemption ceilings and so on and so forth. And given that significant inflation raised from the rice prices and energy prices, the approval rate of the Ishiba administration has dipped quite significantly, as low as 30%. And as Japan faces the imminent upper house election coming in July 2025 this year, LDP is facing significant economic challenges. On the other hand, the part of challenges are obviously coming from the new administration in the United States. As of since January 20, 2025, so just about 2 months ago, the Trump administration, the second Trump 2.0 came in. And as of yesterday, this administration, the new administration in the second round, signed 103 executive orders, 24 proclamations, 27 memoranda in his presidential term, which all kind of kick in gradually into this year and moving forward. Many of them are related to economic policies, including immigration, government efficiency, and just yesterday, 25% tariff on automobile imports based on the Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 was announced. Obviously, this will have an eminent and very significant impact on the global economy, especially of the major partner for the United States, like Japan, Canada, Mexico, and so on and so forth. So these challenges didn't start right this year. It's been brewing in the works for maybe a few decades already. These political events and division of the voters based on the many of the democracies, Japan, United included, really shows the challenge of globalization that imposes various hardship, even though some benefits too, but various hardships in the domestic politics. So here we have these four wonderful presenters, and basically we'll be asking questions regarding, one, how can each country, Japan and US, and maybe other countries beyond, can best manage the structural transition facing globalization, and maybe in the near future, some trends towards deglobalization. The second question would be, how can we create more stable and equitable distribution of income that will reduce these polarization of politics? Again, we are very pleased and very excited to have four great speakers, both from Japan and the United States, and this is my honor to introduce four of them in the order of their presentation. So the first presentation will be by Professor Wasazumi Wakatabe from Waseda University. He's the former deputy governor of the Bank of Japan and professor of faculty of political science and economics at Waseda University. His research focuses on historical relationship between economic crises and economics and central banking in theory and in practice. The second speaker is Dr. Lee Brandstetter. He is the James M. Walton Professor of Economics and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. His research interest focuses on the economics of innovation and the economic and social impact of new technologies. The third in line of presentation is Dr. Stephen Vogel. Stephen Vogel is a director of the Political Economy Program and the Ilhan New Professor of Asia Studies and Professor of Political Science and Political Economy at the University of California, Berkeley. He specialized in the political economy of the advanced industrial nations, especially Japan. And finally, Dr. Chiaki Moriguchi from Hitotsubashi University. She's a professor at Institute of Economic Research at Hitotsubashi University, actually my alma mater. She works on the historical origins of institutional diversity, comparing various economic institutions in the United States and Japan. So I would like to, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Wakatabe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me share my slides. Okay. First of all, I would like to thank all of you to have me on this prestigious panel. Already we have been holding, we are hearing that the word, the challenges. Challenges are kind of understatement at this critical juncture. I think we are seeing the seismic change and sea change in many respects. But without further ado, I'd like to speak about what I think about the current status of globalization and its implications to the distribution and also the way forward. First of all, that's about globalization. I would like to point us three facts. The first, I think that we have been talking about the end of globalization. I think it's still premature. The reason is that we are actually having a kind of stagnation in terms of the trade in goods, but trade in services is flourishing. You know that have been. I watched the Clown on Netflix and Squid Game on Netflix, and I can also watch the Shogun on Disney Plus in Japan. So that's the in that sense, I am the beneficiary. I'm benefiting from the trading services. But second point is that we cannot take globalization for granted. The globalization has been halted or reversed throughout history, so that the globalization is not inevitable. So it can have backlashes, and we may see the end of stagnation of globalization. The third factor is a kind of broadly theoretical hypothesis. I think that the fate of globalization depends, like others, on the race between technology and policy institutional choices. So technology, can have wonderful things like the advancement, improvements in communication and transportation technologies. But I think that to materialize those improvements, we need to have the kind of social scientific technology, meaning policy or institutions. So institutions such as GATT or the WT would strengthen the move toward more globalization. But geopolitical tensions, which has been already mentioned, economic crises, national security concerns, protectionism, and trade wars would hinder or even halt and reverse the move toward globalization. So let me just show you some graphs. I just borrowed from Rick Baldwin's the paper. It's still, I think that the trend is quite obvious. That we see the growth in the trade in services. And this I took from the Doug Irwin's wonderful lecture he gave at the Australian University and National University, I think. And he showed that this kind of long-term perspective about the globalization, the history of globalization throughout history. So we see some ebbs and flows. So, for example, we have the declining phase during the interwar periods up to the reconstruction of the global order after the World War II. So after that, we saw kind of steady growth in globalization, but we are now living in the halting period of globalization. So now, of course, the question is which way we go, from here or to down there, or to maybe stagnating period. So as I said before, that I think that I believe that the fate is not written on stone. So that really depends on our policy and institutional choices. And I would like to have more inclusive and growth-oriented globalization. The Professor Katada mentioned about the kind of political divisions in Japan and also in the United States, I believe, as well. The people tend to think that growth versus redistribution. That's a mistake. I think that we need both. Without growth, we cannot have the resources for redistribution. And without redistribution, we cannot form a kind of consensus to pursue a growth-oriented policy. So I have a bunch of items, but let me tell you about the number 0. That's macroeconomic stabilization, and that has been my specialty in terms of monetary policy. Many people argue that the monetary policy or macroeconomic policies have distributional consequences. So, for example, when central bank buys up assets for the markets, some argue that would favor the asset holders instead of non-asset holders. That much is true, but that's not the whole story. So remember, for example, the period after the global financial crisis, or the period during the COVID-19 pandemic. Suppose the central banks didn't do anything, didn't buy any assets. What would have happened to the economies? So clearly, I think the unemployment rate went up, and the economy were stagnating more than we had in the reality. So I think that's the distributional consequences of monetary policy or macroeconomic policies are actually not the concerns for macroeconomic stabilization. After all, that macroeconomic policy is for macroeconomic stabilization. So, but we do need more sort of redistributive and also growth-oriented policies like education, training, tax subsidies, building infrastructure, industrial regional policy, or maybe even we can go to discuss negative income tax / universal basic income. These are the kind of the options we can have, and all of them are no panacea. So that's we're gonna have to think about the merits and demerits, and some are not tried even. So those are the challenges actually. Let me just talk about the building infrastructure in brief moment. There's a new book by Isla Klein and Derek Thompson. I'm just reading now, which is entitled Abundance. This is a very interesting book, and this advocates for the Americans to build up houses, transportation facilities, and energy facilities. These three areas are the areas which the Americans and also the all over the world, the rest of the world desperately need. And that's they are arguing that we need to embrace technologies, new technologies, and we're going to have to overcome kind of anti-growth sentiments and so on and so forth. So let me conclude with my speculations, thoughts about the challenges beyond economics. We can have many policy or institutional options, but the challenges are more difficult if you think about what are kind of prohibiting us from adopting or contemplating those policy options. So there are multiple difficulties in rebuilding the communities and share a sense of belonging, identity, meaning of work and life. And underlying trends are kind of scary, actually, challenging to say the least. We don't have a shared sort of a common purpose about the way forward. So we're going to have to think about the perception divergence, ideological divisions. Education it may have demerits as well, because education can work for equalizing the societies or to increase the inequalities. After all, if we have more and more emphasis on the higher education, then those who are left from higher educations may feel resentful towards those who have the higher educations. And of course, that's all gets boiled down to a political economy. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Next, Dr. Lee Bradstetter.
All right. So thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this forum. And I also want to express a word of profound thanks. I'm incredibly grateful to have had the benefit of an Abe Fellowship early in my career. I also received support from the Japan Foundation and the Social Science Research Council. So I definitely want to thank the sponsors of this event for investing in my scientific career. I want to begin with the observation that U.S. income inequality has increased sharply in recent decades, especially since the 1980s. And labor economist David Autor of MIT has graphed this explosion of inequality in an especially evocative way that makes it clear how closely aligned this explosion of income equality is with the skills and education of workers. Now, the popular wisdom and certainly the political position of the current president of the United States blames this increased income inequality on manufactured goods imported into the U.S. Right? The basic belief is that U.S. manufacturers can't compete against foreign firms. The loss of high-wage manufacturing jobs results in stagnating or declining wages for less skilled workers. And so if we want to rescue the working class in the United States, then we need to reject international trade and protect our workers with tariff walls. And this line of argument has been around ever since the inequality explosion first began to appear in our official government statistics. And Donald Trump himself has been making this argument ever since he first arose as a public figure in the 1980s. So on this point, at least, Mr. Trump has been quite consistent, right? But a community of scientific experts that study this matter, right, for most of my scientific career, have taken the position that this popular wisdom is almost entirely wrong. And I know this for a fact because, like Alexander Hamilton, I was in the room where it happened, or perhaps to be more precise, I was in the hotel conference room, or at least one of them, where this consensus was worked out, right? And so there's the lovely city of Monterey, California in 1998. My conference hotel was right about there. And at this really amazing conference, I listened to the giants of international economics, like Rob Feenstra and Paul Krugman, and the giants of labor economics, like Alan Kruger and George Borjas, try and sift through the studies that were emerging in the early and mid 1990s, because by then we had gotten just enough data on the inequality explosion that we could begin to assess the degree to which it was driven by trade. And what this august set of experts were concluding at this conference and in other similar conferences was that trade had almost no role in this explosion of income inequality. And they were driven to that conclusion almost in spite of themselves. So the international economists had theories that predicted that rising trade could lead to increased income inequality, right? But these theories made very specific predictions about exactly how and where that inequality would emerge. And when we compared the predictions to the patterns that we were seeing in the data, they just didn't match. Now, there were obviously many factors that were driving the post-80s explosion in income inequality in the United States, right? But again, careful scientific analyses of the data and the data patterns suggested that increased trade just could not account for much of that increase. The most likely main culprit was skill-biased technological change, right? The adoption of new technologies in manufacturing and services that created stronger demand for highly skilled workers, but weaker demand for the less skilled. So when Bill Clinton was trying to decide whether or not to support the ratification of NAFTA or the establishment of the WTO or the admission of China into the WTO, the scientific consensus that he sought basically said, none of this should matter all that much for wage and employment outcomes. But as it turns out, that prediction was wrong, right? And we can see just how wrongly it was in these data, right? So this top line shows aggregate manufacturing employment in the United States from the early 1960s all the way to the late 1990s. And what's striking is how stable it is, right? Aggregate manufacturing employment rises in expansions, it falls in recessions, but averaged over the business cycle, it is impressively stable until we enter the 2000s. And then we have a mild recession in the early 2000s, and manufacturing employment falls off a cliff. It continues to decline even as the US economy recovers from the early 2000s recession, and it collapses again when the global financial crisis begins in the United States. And it has really never recovered, right? Even today, manufacturing employment has not come nearly up to its late 1990s level, and it may never, right? And by around 2010, a group of innovative economists had a very uncomfortable explanation for what was going on and what was causing it. In a word, it was China. These three economists presented very compelling evidence that the export surge that emanated from China after China's accession to WTO accounted for a very large fraction of the job losses in manufacturing that I just showed you. When people lose their jobs in the United States, they become eligible for various kinds of social support programs. These programs are generally not fully adequate to support workers when they lose jobs, but they are eligible for certain benefits. There are always inefficiencies associated with the provision of these benefits, and these three authors concluded that the efficiency losses associated with this wave of job destruction canceled out much, but not all, of the gains from trade with China. Now, this essentially turned the consensus of the late 90s and early 2000s on its head. And I very much remember being in another room when Gordon Hanson first presented these results to an audience of international economists and was met with an iron wall of skepticism. And I was one of the most obnoxious skeptics, right? But the profession was eventually convinced by the quality of Otto Dorn and Hanson's scholarship because they looked for these losses in a new way. And I'm just going to take a moment to explain the very different pathway that they took in order to come to this conclusion. So most prior analysis had looked at industries or firms and tried to measure how different industries in the United States or different firms were confronted with trade shocks, and then measured the employment responses inside those industries or firms. And the innovation of Otto Dorn and Hanson was to look at the regional labor market as the unit of analysis. So they divided the United States into almost 1,000 commuting zones. And these commuting zones were based on actual commuting patterns of US workers, as measured by US statistical agencies. For each of these commuting zones, they measured the exposure of that zone in terms of its distribution of employment across industries to the kinds of manufacturing industries that would witness a wave of Chinese imports after WTO accession. All right. And so the combination of this exposure measure, right, to industry-specific trade flows was their measure of the China shock. And then they could do a regression in which they looked at any labor market outcome you might care about at the commuting zone level, and they regressed it on this measure of the China shock and on a very extensive measure of controls, right? And of course, my argument with Otto Dorn and Hanson was you didn't control for this and you didn't control for that. And eventually they controlled for everything we could all think of, and the results didn't go away. So should these results turn us against trade liberalization, right? Should this make us fans of Donald Trump's trade policy? Well, no, right? For a number of reasons. First, this perfect storm of the early 2000s is unlikely to be repeated anytime soon. The manufacturing in the United States that survived that storm has been and is likely to be pretty resilient. No future trade pact is likely to be as disruptive as the emergence of China as a manufacturing powerhouse in the early 2000s. And even in the midst of this China-generated export wave, even Otto Dorn and Hanson themselves conclude that overall, the US did gain more from access to Chinese-produced manufactured goods than we lost from the job losses. So all that suggests that the current policy experiments being run by the Trump administration are extremely unlikely to result in welfare-improving reindustrialization. But at the same time, we cannot, now that we've learned from Otto Dorn and Hanson, go completely back to our old consensus, right? That we shouldn't worry, right? So what are the policy implications of Otto Dorn and Hanson? Well, trade still conveys benefits, and they're very clear in their papers to emphasize this, but they have shown, right, in a way that we just can't dispute, that the labor market adjustment to trade shocks in the United States and perhaps elsewhere can be far longer lasting and more painful than earlier research suggested. So we need labor market policies that can ease the transition to new employment opportunities. And many economists have their own favorite policy option. If we have time later, maybe I'll talk about my favorite, which is wage insurance for displaced workers. I think it's important to point out that other wealthy nations also trade with China, and they've also withstood this shock and other trade shocks, but it may be that they find it easier to retain free trade policies and pro-trade political coalitions because they have a stronger welfare state that insulates their workers more effectively from the downside of trade shocks. And we may be left with this emerging political reality that the only way to achieve and retain the benefits of more trade, which is something that traditional American conservatives, if there aren't any left, have liked, is to be more willing to let the government redistribute the gains from trade from the winners to the losers in a manner that traditional American liberals like. And so I guess my ending point is very consistent with Professor Wakatabe's ending point. And with that, I will conclude and look forward to the general discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. It's great to hear from both of the first two speakers that there is some hope and deglobalization is not necessarily fate to all of us. So the third in line is, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Stephen Vogel, please.
Thank you very much. So Professor Wakatabe has given us a masterful overview of globalization. Professor Brandstetter has given us a really good view of some of the distributional effects. And both of them have given us some great ideas about policy solutions. So I just want to kind of pick up from there and offer a conceptual framework for evaluating policy solutions. I'm going to use that framework to interpret post-war US and Japanese history and think of a way to maybe set policy priorities. And so that conceptual framework in a nutshell is to juxtapose redistribution versus predistribution. So we can think of redistribution as taking away from some and giving to others. Whereas with predistribution, the goal is to shift the way that the market distributes rewards in the first place. So to make that conceptual distinction concrete, let's think about like 4 buckets of policies. 1, public investment, like education or infrastructure. 2, market governance, or what I like to call market craft. 3, welfare spending. And 4, progressive taxation. And what I'm suggesting is that the first 2 are primarily pre-distributive, and the second 2 are primarily redistributive. Now, I will readily concede that this distinction blurs in practice, and yet I'm going to argue that the conceptual distinction is quite useful nonetheless. So let me apply that as a kind of a framework to rethink US and Japanese history in, let's say, about 2 or 3 minutes. So we'll start with the US and the New Deal. The New Deal of the 1930s, I think, was an incredible combination of both pre-distribution and redistribution, right? You said had pre-distribution in the sense of infrastructure spending, banking reform, labor market reform, et cetera, and a major expansion of the welfare state. So it was really both. Then in the post-war period, the US, kind of in the glory years of the early post-war years focused more on redistribution. They didn't necessarily undo pre-distribution, but maybe perhaps let it languish a bit and focus more on expanding the welfare state. Then by the 1980s, with neoliberalism, you actually had cuts in redistribution, tax cuts for the wealthy, and you had a reversal of pre-distribution policies. So what I would call upward pre-distribution. So for example, that would mean financial reforms and labor market reforms that actually shifted the balance of power more towards those with wealth and power. And as a result of that, you got a disconnect between productivity increases and wages. So this graph that I love to show my students is one where you see productivity growth kind of steady over the whole post-war period in the United States. And it moves perfectly in tandem with the average wages up until 1980, at which point wages flatten, right? So in other words, that the average worker has seen very little increase in their well-being despite continuing increases in productivity. So no big surprise that people are a little bit angry right now. And so you had a rapidly increase in inequality. Professor Brandstetter already showed us some data on that. And that increase was much more pronounced than it was in other countries like Japan. Okay, so now let's shift over to Japan. Japan you can kind of see as a pre-distribution success story in the post-war era. It combined growth and equity, right? You had high public investment in education and infrastructure, relatively equitable market governance, a stable financial system, cooperative labor relations. You also had less redistribution than in most other advanced industrial countries. And politically, you had that kind of a grand bargain that combined pro-growth economic policies with protection for farmers and retailers. And you can think of that as maybe a kind of pre-distribution. I'll come back to that. Yet since the economic crisis, the financial crisis of the 1990s, you could say that Japan has been plagued by a kind of a slow erosion of its pre-distribution advantage. Its comparative advantage in education and training has waned. Market governance has become less egalitarian. You have a more precarious labor system, et cetera. Blanchet, Chancel, and Gethin are these economists who have looked at pre-distribution and redistribution, not in the US and Japan, but in US and Europe. But they come with a really interesting finding, which is that if you're trying to figure out why inequality has grown so much more in the US than in Europe, they find that the root cause is more in pre-distribution than in redistribution. We kind of think of the European welfare states as being much more redistributive, but actually the US economic system is quite redistributive if you think about that we have more progressive tax system than they have in Europe. Fortunately for me, Gethin happens to be down the hall here at Berkeley, so I've been quizzing him about this. He says he doesn't have the same level of granular data on Japan, but Japan seems to fit the European pattern. And so if that's true, then again, the difference in terms of the steepness of US inequality versus Japan being more moderate, the roots might be in pre-distribution, not redistribution. Now, since I'm a political scientist, let me turn to politics for just a moment, starting with the US. One could argue that the failure of pre-distribution has contributed to the plutocratic populism, i.e. Trumpism, that we see in the US today, right? So you've had an erosion of equity and opportunity. American people don't feel that they have the same opportunities that their parents did. Now, I'm certainly not saying that this is the only thing driving the current state of American politics. You also have cultural divides, you have racism and xenophobia, you have the specifics of the Republican Party strategy. But I would argue that those would not have coalesced in the current form without the inequality and how it fomates the frustration that has manifested itself that way. There's an interesting study by Kuzenko, Longe, Marx, and Naidu that find that American voters in general, and less educated Americans in particular, support pre-distribution policies more than redistribution policies. That is, voters care about their pre-tax and transfer income. They value social standing and status, for example, or employment quality, such as job autonomy or flexible hours. So they argue, the authors argue, that the Democrats' supply of pre-distribution policies declined after the 1970s along the lines of what I said a moment ago. And this helps to explain why the Democratic Party lost support from less educated Americans. Turning to Japan. Japan's policies of protection and compensation for farmers or retailers or for more outlying regions of Japan were often seen as inefficient economically. And yet maybe they were pretty effective from a political or political economy perspective, right? Particularly if we look at it through the lens of predistribution. Because today, Japan is an outlier among advanced industrial countries in a good way for once, right? It has much less vulnerability to the kind of plutocratic populism you see in the United States and in many countries in Europe. And one reason may be that Japan delivered pre-distribution in the sense of equal opportunity, less inequality, less economic instability, and people could make a middle-class living as farmers or retailers. So if we use this framework, it suggests some fairly specific guidelines for policy. First, it suggests that governments should seek to eliminate government policies of upward redistribution. Second, they should prioritize public investment in education, health, and infrastructure to further real substantive equality of opportunity over the long term. Third, they should reform market governance to balance market and political power, right? The balance between employers and workers, incumbent firms and challengers, bankers and savers, investors, intellectual property owners and users, the various actors within the economy to try and balance out that power better than we see today. And finally, they shouldn't just engage in predistribution. You need to combine it with redistribution strategies. I have a feeling that Professor Moriguchi will have a few things to say about that with respect to Japan. And as predistribution policies enhance equality of opportunities as well as outcomes, that should allow governments to reduce the costs of redistribution over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fogel. Really good to hear the comparison between the US and Japan in this kind of very systematic way. And we look forward to hearing from Professor Moriguchi on the kind of issues that Steve just raised. Thank you.
Let me share my slides. So I'm continue to talk about inequality, but income inequality in Japan and the relationship with the globalization a little bit. So Piketty and his co-authors has been documenting a very sharp increase in the top income and wealth concentration in the US and other Anglo-Saxon countries since the 1980s. And they largely attribute, among other things, to the financial globalization. And by analogy, in popular discourse in Japan, rise of income inequality in Japan during the lost decades is typically associated with a globalization, in particular increased international competition with the Asian countries, and then also global financial crisis. However, in my opinion, the impact of globalization is much overstated. So in this talk, I would like to provide, I'm an economic historian, so more historical perspectives to understand deeper causes of the Japanese income inequality during the lost decades. And in particular, to do that, I start with the characterization of the what I call Japanese style egalitarianism with a strong middle class that emerged in the 1980s. And this is a similar assessment with just Steve has made. But I would like to emphasize the impact of the demographic changes as well as prolonged economic stagnation on the premises of this Japanese style of the egalitarianism. And this is just comparing this economic growth in the last 120 years in the US and Japan. And what is amazing about Japan is it has this kind of two economic miracle period before the war, before the Second World War and after the war. And then this lost decades since the 1990s. But this implication of the economic growth on the inequality is very sharply different before the war and after the war. And just to show that, this is the top 1% income concentration measure in Japan that I made with Emmanuel Saez. And it's really high concentration of income at the top before the war. And then this precipitous fall during the war, and then it stayed fairly low, just recently slight increase. So this is the case of Japan. The second economic miracle was achieved under the egalitarianism, like economic equality. And then to compare that with the US, the blue lines are US, and US has been like a similarly low, fairly, how to say, the high equality achieved in the 60s, but now sharply rising recently. Okay. And so what is this Japanese style egalitarianism that emerged during the high growth period and then achieved pretty much at the height in the 1980s? And then I say that this is premised on these four things. One is this relatively homogeneous household comprised of male regular employee married to non-working spouse, and very sharp division, gender-based division of labor within the household. Basically, the man's working and then female not working and taking care. And then the company providing employment security and training and high wage to regular employees. And then private, as opposed to public, private assistance for the elderly family members. So basically, as a result, the Japanese style egalitarianism is characterized by equality of household income before redistribution. And this is very much opposite to the Nordic model of egalitarianism, which is based on equality of individual income after redistribution. And because of this, the Japanese social security system centers on social insurance and then really largely on old age pensions, but very, very meager, limited on the poverty relief because it relies on the private assistance for the poor family members. And also, if you look at the household income, it's relatively equally distributed. But if you look at the individuals within the household, individual income within the household is unequally distributed, both across gender, namely husband and wife, but also regular and non-regular employment. And to show this a little bit, try to show this in graph. So this is the so-called, the government called the standard household, the Hyojun Setai. This is the majority of the household in the 1980s. And this is made of this regular employed male, married to non-working female and having children. And they also assist the elderly parents, and they are done by this non-working female. This is private assistance. And the firm is providing employment security and high wage to this regular employee male who is the household head. And the government is mainly providing pension to elderly male. And then this male will share this with a female. So this kind of the standard, this household is nicely complementary. And then this fairly homogeneous household. So they are relatively equal in income before redistribution because this earning male, highly earning male is coupled with a non-earning female, and they also helping the elderly. However, what happens after this 1980s is that the demographic shift of aging and lower fertility, and also this family is more living not in this big family, but in a more separate way. So basically, the first thing that we notice is because of the prolonged economic stagnation, non-regular employment increase as opposed to regular employment. So now the male is not necessarily having a regular employment, but it's a non-regular employee. And then married to non-regular employee female. And then these tend to have no job security and low wage. Another pattern is the female divorcing the male and or unmarried, or so they're becoming a single mother households. And also the big part is that the lots of elderly households not living together with the children. And then when the male dies and become single person elderly female household, and this is a huge in number since 1990s, increasing sharply. And these are relatively poor, low income household. And then government is providing relatively low poverty relief and therefore a more higher poverty rate. So this is the big shift, demographic change together with the economic stagnation, creating this larger poverty, low income household. So this is basically what I'm explaining here. So the inequality in Japan since the 1980s are characterized by the rising poverty without rich getting richer, which differs sharply from the US pattern. And Japan's problem is not an economic polarization or resulting a political polarization as in the US, but a low innovation and inadequate safety net. And to show this, I have a bit of graphs. I don't know if I have a time, but this is basically showing the income, income distribution. This is the 1981 is taking as a starting point, and then looking at each income percentile, percentile income is how much they're growing over time. And this is the bottom income, and this is the top income. And then it's fanning out, meaning inequality is rising, but actually it's not very sharp rise. It looks sharp, but if you compare to the US, this is a very moderate increase. But what is interesting about Japan is this bottom income stagnating and actually going down in absolute level. So this is the lost 2 decades. So that the lower income households are becoming poorer in absolute terms. And then the top income people are kind of stable but not growing. And also the top income is not going further out higher. So the top income, this top 5%, 10% is almost like the same level, which is very different from the US. In the US, higher income percentile is growing faster and so on. And then this right graph is after redistribution. So it's kind of compressed a little bit because of this progressive income tax and so on. But the interesting thing is that the bottom income is not helped by much after redistribution. And this is the evidence of this poor relief by government is really not working adequately to help the poor households in Japan. And also what is interesting about Japan is this gender inequality in income always existed, and also the inequality between regular employees and non-regular employees within the same firm always existed. But as long as it was only female who's taking non-regular work, it never became a social concern. But when the male began to take non-regular jobs for the first time, after the Lehman shock and so on, lost 2 decades, it became the social concern for the first time. And then government started to move somewhat. So that's kind of a very kind of gender unequal way of responding politically. And this is to show that the Japan is in particularly, Japan has this very sharp gender division in terms of these female is very high in taking the non-standard, non-regular job, and male is low. And then other country has more similar gender similarity, but Japan has a very sharp gender inequality in the assignment of the good job and a bad job. And then as a result, this is showing the relative poverty rate by gender and age, and the red is female, and female tend to be higher in poverty rate and much higher in the old age, because these are the single elderly person, single female living, and they're not having enough pensions or any government assistance and so on. So the poverty is also very much gendered in Japan. So my kind of going forward, I would like to propose that in Japan, we need to design a new system that acknowledges or that's based on the gender inequality and the diversity of human capital. And then not only gender, but also we are having increasing number of the foreign workers, and they're very heterogeneous too, but we are nowhere having any enough infrastructure to embrace this foreign workers or female workers in a regular job. And so on. And also we need to rebuild this social security system that use individual rather than a household as a fundamental unit of the society. This will end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Moriguchi. I was kind of thinking about demography, so this is really great to hear all these fundamentals, and especially the gender issues, which I see quite a bit in Japan myself. So first of all, I would like all the audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. Nicole is monitoring, and I will moderate the questions for after a while. First of all, but I would like to give the time for audience to think about these questions while I ask a few questions to the presenters. I would like to kind of spend 5 minutes each on three cluster of questions. First, two mostly addressed to Dr. Wakatabe and Brandstetter, and looking at the kind of impact of globalization and maybe differentiated impact of it. So my first question here is globalization is not a kind of uniform process where some get hurt, some get there's a lot of losers and winners in this. And I would like to know how would you see that, especially first of all, Professor Wakatabe, in the context of Japan, what are the kind of globalization, economic globalization has meant to Japan, some Japanese population, or maybe different sectors over time, and how that's been kind of addressed, especially compared to the United States. The other kind of part of the question here is that Dr. Brandstetter talked quite a bit about the China shock, which is a really big issue. I wonder if that is similar or relevant for Japan or works in a very different way. And finally, again, kind of in the cluster of this question, now that China's growth has slowed, is this still an issue, especially now you see that technological competition between the US and China quite a bit, or is it more of the concern about not only the overcapacity, but the stagnation per se? So all kind of this macro issues, but a little bit on the distribution among the different groups. Could you address them, some parts of it, at least, Professor Wakatabe?
Well, thank you, the first question about the winners and the losers, it is quite obvious from the basic model. The reason why we could have the gains from trade is that precisely because we can move resources from comparatively less advantageous sector to more comparatively advantageous sector. So that the gains from trade means that we need a kind of the change in at least the allocation of resources. So that in that sense, globalization always have winners and losers. But I think that's what the economists have been emphasizing is that the overall gain from trade must overweigh the costs associated with the adjustment. Having said that, I think that we have to think closely about these adjustment costs, because these adjustment costs are kind of concentrated on those who have to change, right? So that's why that's quite difficult and challenging for the economists to kind of convince people. Now, speaking about the differences between the U.S. and Japan, I must say that the Japanese people as a whole still favor the free trade. Okay, so despite many sort of stagnation. So I think that as Professor Moriguchi pointed out, some people blame, for example, the so-called neo-liberal agenda or the globalization as a culprit of the Japan's long stagnation. But that has not yet been kind of ingrained into the minds of the Japanese people. While I think the others, I think in the United States, if you read the kind of Trumpism going on, then I think that there is a strong sort of resentment against the globalization, the agenda. So in that sense, the people's mind, I think in Japan still, the globalization is not necessarily associated with the long stagnation. So, but having said that, I gather quite interesting that Stephen's remark about the rise of the plutonic populism, right? Plutocracy and the combination of plutocracy and populism. That is not yet happening in Japan. I think that the plutocrats prefer kind of the so-called neoliberal agenda still. So populists are in favor of sort of nationalist agenda. So in that sense, in Japan, I think that's the politically speaking, that these two things are not yet converging. So that's my observation. About China, let me just say a little bit about China. China's slowing down is a huge story, and it actually requires more, I think, another session to discuss this huge issue. Let me just say that first of all, I think that the Chinese economy is more or less like repeating the mistakes of Japan in the 1990s in terms of economics policy. Now, of course, the underlying cause is the structure of the Chinese political economic system is quite different from Japan. But having said that, but I think that the China is experiencing more difficulties. Then I think that the problem is that the way forward for the China. If they are going to stagnate economy, they're going to have to do what the Japan painfully discovered during the 1990s and the early 2000s. Okay, so are they going to implement those the corrective measures to counter economic stagnation, or are they going to take another path, which Japan couldn't afford to? I mean, that's more or less like an expansionary policy in terms of the geopolitical and political sense. I mean, that's so in that sense, that's a huge story. In terms of globalization, I think the disruption to the globalization would be exacerbated by this slowing down of China.
Thank you. Dr. Brunstead?
Yeah, you ask so many great questions. Maybe I'll be a little bit selective in my response. Let me first start with the China shock. The China shock has played out very differently in different countries and over different time periods. So when Otto and Hansen wrote their paper with US data, that inspired a lot of economic research teams around the world to try and do something similar. And there were, very many different results that were uncovered by this. So, for instance, in Germany, you don't really see the same kind of China shock. And that's partly because, in the 2000s and maybe even in the early 2010s, while China was ramping up its production and export of labor-intensive goods of all kinds, it was a fanatically enthusiastic importer of German capital goods, right, machine tools, and advanced manufactured goods, right? So, the impact of the China, accession to WTO on Germany's trade balance, right, and on German manufacturing industry was quite different in the early 2000s than it was in the United States. But consider what might happen over the next decade, right? I mean, the Chinese automobile industry has figured out how to make extremely low-cost electric vehicles, right? They're fairly high performance, and they're just an intrinsically more efficient and simpler kind of automotive technology than the internal combustion engine-based models that the Germans have been perfecting ever since they invented the gasoline-powered car more than 100 years ago. So what could play out over the next 10 years, and what the Germans are extremely worried about, is that they're facing a China shock. Even as the Chinese macroeconomy slows down, right, the locus of direct competition between China's export industries and Germany's is likely to significantly expand, right? And China's need for German output of capital goods and advanced manufacturers is also declining, partly because of slower growth and partly because of structural change inside the Chinese economy, right? And so my German friends are very worried about a kind of China shock at the same time that they're dealing with a Trump shock and a Russia shock. I'm personally concerned that, Japan may feel some of the same stresses, right? I mean, for a long time, the Japanese have continued to be extremely competitive in automobile manufacturing. It's become an even more important component of Japan's export portfolio than it used to be, given the weakening of electronics and some other manufacturing industries, right? As Chinese EVs start to steal away market share from Japanese cars around the world, what does that mean for Japan? I'm worried that Japan could be facing a new China shock at the same time that they're dealing with a Trump shock. Maybe I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. Sorry, I'm excited, so I asked too many questions. I will try to be a bit more concise next round. So with Dr. Fogel and Moriguchi about inequality, my general question is so I hear that Dr. Fogel's point is that Japan and US are quite different. Japan's been managing with the pre-distribution and all that, while Moriguchi's point is that Japan is now facing quite a bit of inequality. But obviously there are some policy measures. So the question here is, where does this policy measure come from in the sense of the kind of fundamentals of the choices? Is that just politics, or what else is going on one side? And one major thing I would like to really know is that the fiscal position of Japan is really dire. Obviously US is dire too, but Japan is double that. So I wonder how the kind of government instruments that would be allowing, many, especially Japan, but to some extent the United States, to engage in, especially the pre-distribution policy is limited or not. Maybe still start with Dr. Follow.
Okay, I'll start at the end, which is that pre-distribution policies do not have to be costly. I gave two buckets, the public investment bucket, which does tend to be, can be expensive, but if it's a matter of just evening things out, it doesn't necessarily mean a total increase. And the market governance side does not have to be expensive at all. It's more a sense of regulatory change. So actually in a moment when a government is constrained fiscally, I think that market governance or market craft solutions are particularly salient. So if you wanted to change the economic balance between different actors within the economy, you can use regulatory tools to do so. So that might be labor regulations to change them to be more favorable towards employees and less favorable towards employers. Japan has actually moved in that direction, maybe albeit very slowly. But I would argue that Japan for many years was moving in an employer-friendly direction. And then with Hateraki Kaikaku, the work style reform, in the more recent years, at least the direction has changed slightly. So I guess to your point about fiscal capacity, there's a lot of regulatory changes that don't require, they do require political will, so that I'll acknowledge that problem, but they don't necessarily require huge additions. And then go back to the public investment side, maybe I'll just mention, if we look at the United States, I mean, one of the hugest problems in the United States is that education spending is regressive. In other words, we spend the most money on the most wealthy districts. In Japan, that's much more even, and there's European countries that actually have progressive education spending. So you wouldn't necessarily have to increase the total, but you could just balance it out better. That would already be a step in the right direction.
So Moriguchi Sensei, any views?
I don't have much to say, but Japan is, I think it's really putting huge weight on the economic and political stability for sure. And I think it's very slow to change, for better or worse. Maybe better for political stability, but probably worse for innovations and kind of moving towards the right direction. But in terms of the physical constraints, I think Japan's facing a huge budget issue, but still lots of this social security issues is kind of emphasizing the elderly population, and then recently more on children. And I think more national consensus is gradually moving towards children because it's this low fertility is a major national issue. But still, I think we have probably too much on the elderly. So that kind of, and also the huge population is in the elderly and they're voting. So I guess that balance is difficult to shift. And I would like to ask political scientists to how to make a bargain on this difficult issue.
So Wakatabe Sensei would like to comment on the fiscal situation, but does Dr. Fogler has a kind of an issue on the political situation, political dimension?
Why don't you go to Wakatabe Sensei?
Okay. First of all, yes, please. Wakatabe
Okay,
Sensei.
thank you very much. I think that the fiscal situation in Japan has had difficulties for sure, and if you think about, but I think currently, I think Japanese fiscal situation is improving because we have inflation and we have the growth in nominal growth, and finally, I think the nominal growth has returned to Japan. Okay, so in that sense, we are conquering deflation, and the reason why the Japan has accumulated lots of debt per GDP relative to GDP. Twofold. First, the economic stagnation itself. Okay, so the economic stagnation did not raise any tax revenues, so that the government had to put money into the economy. The second reason is the increased spending on the social security, which due to owes to the aging and the having less and less children. So I think for the first issue, if we can manage to have robust nominal growth, that would obviously that's actually increasing the revenues now. So by one estimate, Japan's fiscal balance, it's for this year, has reached already in a surplus rather than in a deficit. And the Japan's debt to GDP ratio is rapidly declining. Okay, I wouldn't say that Japan doesn't have fiscal problem, but I think that we have some rooms for improvement. And also, there is the kind of the reason to believe that the Japan stagnation owes to the lack of the willingness to pursue consistent fiscal expansion, okay, throughout the decades. So we had some recovery, then that's the more raised consumption tax and so on and so forth. That kind of cycle must be broken. But I think that if we can to continue this growth path, we don't really have to worry about fiscal condition. But now, of course, the reallocating the budget is the huge issue. So we're going to have to tackle the second issue of increased spending on social securities. There, I'm not quite sure, that the political equilibrium would be that we can, redistribute these incomes, the spending to the more growth-oriented sector. That's a big challenge. I'd like to hear the opinion from Steve.
Steve?
So for Japan, I guess I tend to be a little bit more optimistic about the Japanese political economy since I'm living through chaos in the United States. But I mean, I guess I would say in terms of a more growth-oriented or innovation model for Japan, Japan has been trying to emulate the Silicon Valley model for 30 or 40 years. And so I like to comfort my Japanese friends and say, don't worry about it. There's 35 mayors and 500, others in the United States who are trying to do the same thing, and they're failing just as badly. My point being, I don't think you can necessarily emulate a an innovation model that's not organic. And so Japan should play from a strength, which might be in very different areas. In terms of the ability of the government and industry to coordinate, investment, industrial policy, increasing research and development. Obviously, Japan has a mismatch in the labor market in terms of the skills that are required of the 21st century. And I know that's been a priority for the government, but obviously, I think moving far too slowly. So I guess I'm more optimistic, at least in the short term, about the Japanese government's ability to get things done. And yes, in areas, it's been moving too slowly, but it's been moving on the right direction, I guess I would say, in terms of like prioritizing, for example, human resource development and investment in promoting technologies. Those are the right areas to think about. And even in labor markets, I was saying that there again, the progress has been way too slow, but at least it's moving in the right direction instead of the wrong direction for a change. So, hard to imagine right now this, as you said, Professor Katada, is not a great moment in Japanese politics either, in terms of the support for the current administration. But going past that, I think that there's a real possibility that Japan could get back on a reasonable course.
Thank you. So thank you. So the last quick question that I'm kind of happy to hear that everybody has pretty positive outlook on in terms of the future and the kind of solution or the ways to address the challenge that the world is facing now. But I would like to kind of kind of round of maybe kind of one by one to give us kind of a one quick sense of what is the kind of a Goldilocks solution. What is the kind of perfect solution? I think Wakatabe Sensei already said it's a growth and growth and distribution all at the same time. But how that could be kind of managed, and maybe some kind of pain that has to be endured, but can be can be important for the future that we really would like to strive with the globalization and equality coming at the same time. So maybe Wakatabe Sensei, just one quick word of advice to the world.
Well, I'm not in a position to give advice, but I would like to see. We'd like to have kind of the ideas. I mean, that's the first of all, we're gonna have to agree on something. Okay, so right now, I think that's the kind of platform for let's say making consensus is being challenged. So that's the biggest worry for me. I think we're gonna have to rebuild that kind of platform through which we can discuss and form consensus. And also after that we can implement those consensus. But I think that's right now I'm quite worried about that kind of consensus has been rapidly eroding.
Yeah, thank you. Lee?
I share the concern about a broken consensus, but if you're looking for one policy idea that I think should get a lot more attention, I'll use this to highlight wage insurance. The idea is simple, right? If someone faces a permanent decline in their skill because of an adverse technological change or a trade shock, then they're able to draw upon an insurance fund that covers part of, maybe a big part of the gap between the job they used to have and the income they used to have and the best job that they can now get, right? And that income supplement follows them for several years. Now, for a long time, this was just a theoretical curiosity that was favored by economists. And Steve, I don't know if you would regard this as pre-distribution or redistribution, right? But the Obama administration actually engaged in a policy experiment to see how this would work. And my colleague at Carnegie Mellon, Brian Kovac, got hold of the data and was able to evaluate it. And this policy more than pays for itself, right? It induces people who face these adverse shocks to find jobs, to stay in the labor market, right? They benefit from continued employment, right? The income losses that they would otherwise have to sustain and manage are considerably ameliorated, and the tax revenue generated by the additional unemployment more than pays for the program, right? So this is a great idea that I think should be investigated.
Great, thanks. Dr. Fogel?
Well, so first thing I'd like to say is that I would like to take issue with the presumption, not of these panelists, but out there in the world, that there's necessarily a trade-off between growth and equity. Because I think what Japan proved in the early post-war years is that you can have both. And what Japan and the United States are perhaps showing is that you can also have neither. Or to put it more poignantly, that inequality can be a drag on growth. So that you could have either a positive association or a negative association. Having said that, I think my idea is pre-distribution. I think that that's the lens through which both the United States and Japan should formulate their solutions, again, in an ideal world. The only thing I'll add to that is that I think Japan could do more on redistribution as well. That I think the Japanese government has been too shy to spend, maybe because of the fiscal situation. But again, properly designed welfare policies, a stronger social safety net can make a stronger economy and can, like the policies that Lee was suggesting, can pay for themselves in the right conditions.
Thank you. Moriguchi Sensei?
Against the US president, I'm going for diversity and inclusion, especially for Japan. I think Japan is still kind of this huge kind of legacy of being a supposedly the homogeneous society, and then we have a lack of infrastructure to embrace diverse population. And it's not only gender, but talking about nationality or language or and then that will probably make more innovative society. And I think that's US can be argued that it's going too much in that way too fast, and that's getting this kind of bit of backlash, but not a bit of a big backlash. But Japan is really like really behind, and then but also Japanese population tend to be conservative about something new, so we have to build consensus for sure, but still we need a infrastructure investment to really have a more diverse members in the society.
Great, thank you. So we have a few questions per kind of speaker, so we will send that to you. But one big question that's kind of looming large, and I think everybody's touched on it, is Trump 2.0. So how do you understand it? How does it affect not only what you have mentioned, some of the solutions possibly in place, but kind of the globalization overall, given that it's only 2 months since his administration started, and we are seeing a lot of policies that is kind of highlighting the kind of interest of the people who are much more interested in kind of limiting or countering globalization. So that's the question from the audience. Anybody to take up? Maybe we'll start with Lee, because you talked about American economy the most.
Sure. Steve, I hope you won't hate me for saying this, but at some level, the Trump tariffs are a pre-distributive solution. I just don't think they're going to work very well, right? What's currently happening is that in the face of a Congress that is afraid to go against him, Trump is exploiting national security provisions, longstanding national security provisions in our trade laws to, basically rip up every commitment the United States has ever made to its trading partners or to the WTO. I think the costs of this are going to be quite high for the American people. I think those costs are going to start to register in relatively short order. And the simple fact of the matter was that Trump did not win by a landslide. It was actually fairly modest margins in a few swing states. And those people were voting against inflation and high interest rates, not necessarily for this guy. So I think the failure of this policy, right, will set us up for another shift. But when that comes, we'll have to confront the problem that Professor Wakatabe, really highlighted. How do we rebuild a consensus that can withstand a change in administrations? And that's going to be tough.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, obviously it's a political issue.
May I
Sure, Wakatabe-sensei.
I think that's the one factor which we are not talking about is that the Trump Mr. Trump won the general election because people are fed up with inflation and the surge in the housing prices, among other things like the cultural issues. So there are kind of discontent about inflation. But if you think about Mr. Trump's economic policies, setting the raising tariffs and so on and so forth, they are, and also the tax reductions for the rich people, or kind of those things, they would contribute to more inflation, and they would contribute to actually the appreciation of the U.S. dollar. So I think that Mr. Trump's policies are kind of self-defeating, in a sense that that if you have the inflation down the road, then that the U.S. competitiveness would be eroded further down. So in that sense, so it's quite it's not puzzling, but it doesn't really make sense. That I mean that they are not achieving the presumed purposes of the policies.
Thank you. Anything from Steve or Jackson? Yeah, Steve.
I can just comment on maybe on the politics side. Like how did we get Trump, which is an incredible puzzle, but it's because he's not really delivering economic benefits to the people who voted for him, and part of that is because of the cultural divide. It's kind of a bait and switch, and this is actually not just the United States. Any party on the right is going to have this dilemma of how do you get the votes of lower and middle class people if you're not actually going to help them? And the answer is you appeal to other things like culture or ethnicity or nationalism or racism, and I think that's certainly been Trump's strategy, except that it's kind of like in an extreme form in the current moment. We had a great talk by a guy named Michael Shepard, I think it was last week, who looks at rural voters in the United States and how the worse things get. So like Republicans come in and make bad policies and their health gets worse, and then they vote even more for Republicans. So it's kind of like this doom loop where poor performance actually of the economy and in other areas actually increases support for those parties. But it's possible that this strategy may have, that Trump may have overplayed his hand. Way too soon to tell, but we do see the backlash to the backlash on the horizon.
Yeah, well, thank you. So Jackson, we have 1 minute, and we would like to thank Nicole Levitt from SSRC at the end. But do you have anything to add, Jackson? Okay, so I would like to thank all the 4 wonderful presenters. Really learned a lot, and this is really a cutting edge thing and a lot of uncertainties forward, but I am kind of taking away quite a few policy measures would be there for us to do. If you have a will, there'll be a way. So give the floor back to Nicole. Thank you for organizing this.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. I'm Nicole Levitt from the Social Science Research Council, and I just want to thank again all of our panelists and our chair. Really appreciate you working with us, and we found a good time to do it that spans almost an entire day, but with some people visiting at night and some in the morning. I also want to thank our audience that joined us, and would also like to note that we have audience from all over the world tonight. We have people from India and Hungary and Japan and the US and the UK and Australia. So we have spanned the globe tonight, as well as many time zones. If you enjoyed tonight's talk, we do this once a year, and it's always advertised on the SSRC's Twitter feed, well, X feed, LinkedIn, as well as our website. So we'd love to have you join us again. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.